"You're fired." The words rang out sharp enough to slice through the chatter of the diner. For a moment, no one moved. Then all eyes swung to Clara Ara, caught in the harsh glare of her manager's triumph. Minutes earlier, she had slipped a wrinkled bill from her apron just enough to cover a $5 stew for the frail man at table 7. She thought no one had noticed. Brenda had. Now she dragged Clara Ara forward, voice rising like a verdict, a breach of company law, an act that endangered order. The clatter of plates fell silent, customers leaned closer, colleagues froze mid-step. Clara Ara's cheeks burned as she whispered, "It was my own money." The man she had fed stared at the floor, powerless shoulders bowed beneath invisible chains. Brenda's eyes gleamed as if she had struck gold. The kindness that saved a stranger had cost Clara Ara her livelihood. The alarm shrieked at 5, rattling against the chipped plaster wall. Clara Ara jolted upright, her back a dull ache after 12 relentless hours on her feet. The room smelled of yesterday's coffee gone bitter, mingling with the faint detergent on clothes that never quite lost their dampness. She swung her legs to the cold linoleum toes, curling as if against the weight of her life. The apartment was bare, its walls flaking its silence heavy. A curtain, thin and frayed, leaked a pale gray light, stripping the space of warmth. She sat there for a moment, chest rising and falling slowly, eyes scanning the cramped living room where bills lay scattered envelopes unopened. Her body ached for more rest, but rest was luxury. What surrounded her was not home so much as shelter, 4 walls too small for hope, barely holding together under the strain of poverty. Yet she rose because survival had no snooze button. From the narrow bedroom came a cough, dry and rattling, slicing through the silence. Clara Ara hurried in, her heart pinched tight. On the nightstand, the nebulizer sat like a grim monument, plastic tubing curled around it, reminding her of debts she could not pay. Leo, only 7, lay against the faded sheets, face pale but lips twitching in a small smile. "Mom, are you going to work today?" he asked, his voice thin, wrapped in exhaustion. She pressed her palm to his forehead, warmth rising beneath her skin, and swallowed the knot in her throat. She smiled, but the corners of her mouth trembled. "We'll see," she whispered, dodging the truth. His laughter came soft, a child's effort to pretend normal. Her eyes burned as she turned away, carrying the quiet weight of every unpaid bill, every medicine half-dosed, every promise she longed to keep, but couldn't. On the shelf beside the window stood a framed photograph, Clara Ara, Leo still a toddler, and David smiling with the careless hope of a man who believed life was just beginning. David had been a chef in the same empire that now ruled her days. He was once praised for his craft until the day he used flour, sugar, and eggs from the pantry to bake a simple cake for a dishwasher who had never had one. A gesture of kindness turned into a sentence of exile. Management called it theft, and he was dismissed without mercy. The blow broke something in him, ambition dissolved, confidence bled dry. Work never came steady after that. Shame hung heavy until his shoulders bent beneath it, and within a year he was gone, leaving behind only debts and 2 faces carved in grief. For Clara Ara, every morning was a reminder the company had stolen her husband first, and now it threatened to steal her future. She slipped into the uniform, its faded yellow clinging to her like a second skin, heavy with the stench of fryer oil that no detergent could wash away. The fabric scratched her arms, stiff and tired from endless cycles of wear. Standing before the mirror, she hardly recognized herself, lines etched where youth once lingered, eyes dulled but steady, framed by hair pulled back into a no-nonsense knot. She bent over Leo, pressing a kiss against his temple, lingering long enough to feel his soft breath. He stirred, half asleep, whispering something she couldn't quite catch, but the sound pinned itself to her heart. Then she stepped out into Chicago's brittle air, the streets gray with frost and noise, her coat barely shielding her from the cold. She walked quickly each step, driven by necessity, by the unshakable truth that survival meant silence, obedience, endurance. To provide for her son, she would bend until she nearly broke, but never quite enough to shatter. The golden spoon buzzed like a hive at dawn. Waitresses darted between tables, balancing trays with the speed of muscle memory, their smiles stretched thin under fluorescent lights. Behind the counter, cooks slammed plates onto the pass, each clang a reminder of time slipping away. Brenda moved among them with her clipboard clutched like a weapon, eyes sharp, lips tight. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone demanded compliance. Whispers circulated between the staff roomers that Harlan West himself might arrive unannounced, the kind of inspection that could end careers with a single misstep. Clara Ara tightened the strings of her apron, pulse quickening. Around her shoulders, hunched laughter died, and the tension thickened like grease on the floor tiles. This was no ordinary shift. The air itself felt measured, every breath weighed. And Brenda thrived on it, her power drawn from fear, her gaze promising that one wrong move would not go unnoticed. The morning rush began, faces blurring into demands. At booth 4, the old man grumbled as always that his coffee was too hot. Clara Ara nodded with practiced patience, refilling his cup as though she hadn't heard the same words yesterday and the day before. Across the aisle, a group of tourists hesitated, scanning the menu with confusion, their indecision eating away precious minutes. She leaned in, gentle offering suggestions until their orders settled. Mr. Henderson, seated at his usual spot, launched into his favorite joke, the punchline worn thin with repetition. Clara Ara let out a small laugh, not forced but fragile, a reminder of the kindness she refused to lose. Then came the sudden clatter of spectacles hitting the floor. She bent, quickly retrieved them, and placed them back into the trembling hands of an elderly guest. From the counter, Brenda's eyes fixed on her, tapping her watch with exaggerated precision. Clara Ara's faint smile faltered, but only for a breath before she carried on. The bell above the door gave a hollow jingle, and a man stepped inside. His coat was torn at the seams, his hair matted in uneven clumps, and his shoes looked as though they had carried him across 100 cold nights. The room seemed to recoil at once. Brenda's eyes narrowed, her body angling toward the door, ready to drive him back into the street before he could even sit. Clara Ara moved faster, sliding between them, her hand lightly gesturing toward an open booth. This way, she said, her tone gentle, yet firm. The man hesitated, shoulders hunched as if expecting rejection. When she met his gaze, his blue eyes flickered with surprise. He lowered his head, murmuring thanks in a voice almost swallowed by shame. Brenda's jaw tightened, fury visible in the sharp lines of her face, but she stopped short, trapped in the awkward gaze of customers now watching. The choice had been made. Compassion had claimed the table before policy could. Seated in the booth, the man fumbled with the menu, barely glancing at its pages. His words came halting, each syllable dipped in embarrassment. "What's the cheapest thing you have that's filling?" Clara Ara leaned in, slightly lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. She pointed to the stew, a dish not even printed on the menu, hearty, and only $5. His eyes lifted to hers, a flash of gratitude softening his weariness. "The stew," he whispered. Minutes later, the bowl sat before him, steam curling upward. He ate slowly, savoring every bite with an almost reverent hunger, tearing the bread into small pieces to clean the bowl. Clara Ara kept his glass, filled, her movements unnoticed by most, but not by Brenda. From across the room, the manager's glare cut sharp, her disapproval pulsing like a warning. To her, it was wasted time, wasted space. To Clara Ara, it was dignity returned to a man the world refused to see. While he ate, his eyes rarely left Clara Ara. He watched as she knelt beside an elderly couple, guiding their fingers along the tiny print of the menu. He saw her slip crayons to a restless child, easing a mother's burden with a small kindness. He noticed her shoulder the weight of shattered glass when another waitress dropped a tray, offering comfort rather than complaint. Each gesture revealed more than service. It was instinct, a quiet defiance against the indifference around her. And still he saw the shadow trailing her. Brenda's reprimands, whispered like threats each second at his table, recorded as loss. Clara Ara nodded through the scolding face, unreadable, but her eyes carried a weariness that spoke louder than words. The man's hands tightened on the rim of his glass, the blue of his gaze sharpening as memory imprinted every detail. To all others, he was invisible. To himself, he was taking stock. What unfolded before him was no accident. It was a truth he could not unsee. The man shifted uneasily, reaching into one pocket, then another. His fingers moved faster, fumbling, searching his expression, unraveling from mild confusion to outright panic. His breath grew shallow, chest rising and falling with a frantic rhythm. "My wallet," he stammered, voice cracking under the weight of dread. I don't have any money." The words seemed to hang in the air, pressing against every ear in the diner. A hush swept across the room, followed by low murmurs, curious eyes swiveling toward the booth. Forks clinked against plates, then stopped. Clara Ara froze, tray balanced on her palm, her heart sinking like a stone. It was the one scenario every server feared, the one the manuals warned against. The stew sat half-finished before him, steam still curling into the air like a cruel reminder. She tightened her grip on the tray, the blood draining from her face. Trouble had arrived at her table and she could already feel the weight of what it would cost. The company's policy was not flexible, not merciful. Training drilled it into them: if a customer could not pay, the server must not intervene. No negotiations, no compromises. Call the manager, call security if necessary, and let the rule do its work. Clara Ara knew it by heart, had heard Brenda recite it like scripture. Across the diner, Brenda stood poised, eyes narrowed, lips already tightening in expectation. She wanted this. She was waiting. Clara Ara's mind whirled Leo's prescription still waiting at the pharmacy, the unpaid rent slipping further out of reach, the fragile balance of survival that left no room for mistakes. She pressed her lips together, staring at the man's trembling hands. He looked ready to vanish through the floor, swallowed by humiliation, and she, caught between the rule and her conscience, felt the grip of fear squeeze tighter around her chest. Her brow furrowed. One thought pulsed in her mind: if she followed the law, she would betray herself. Her hand moved before reason could stop it. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulling out the crumpled bills she had scraped together during the morning rush. A handful of ones, a few coins enough to cover the stew. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the notes, slipping them into the register with a quick motion as though routine could disguise rebellion. She tapped the keys on the terminal, marking the meal as paid in cash. Sweat prickled at her hairline, her pulse hammering in her throat. The entire act lasted seconds, but it stretched in her chest like an eternity. Across the diner, Brenda's presence burned against her back, though Clara Ara didn't dare turn. She only glanced once more at the man, offering the faintest nod, a reassurance he didn't have to flee. It was everything she had: her gas money, her groceries, the fragile thread of her safety. But she chose him, and in that moment she knew she had crossed a line that could never be undone. The words fell like ice against her neck. "What are you doing?" Brenda's voice was sharp enough to still her blood. Clara Ara froze, hand still lingering in the open drawer bills trapped between her fingers. Slowly, she turned, her face drained of color. Brenda stood, close eyes narrowed to slits, her presence suffocating. "Open your hand." The command left no room for resistance. Clara Ara hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. She unfolded her palm, revealing the wrinkled tip money, her last defense against despair. Brenda's lips curved into a cruel smile, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes like a blade catching light. Around them, the diner carried on in half silence, tension rippling outward as though the room itself knew a trap had been sprung. Clara Ara's pulse thundered in her ears. There was nothing left to hide, no excuse strong enough to soften Brenda's grip on this moment. The kindness that had saved one man had handed her straight into the enemy's hands. Brenda straightened, her voice rising so that every corner of the diner could hear. She recited the company's policy with deliberate precision, each clause a nail driven into a coffin. Words like violation and unauthorized transaction cut through the air, stripping Clara Ara of dignity in front of staff and strangers alike. "This employee is a danger to our standards," Brenda declared, her tone swelling with self-righteous triumph. Forks clinked to plates and fell still. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes converged on the trembling figure in the center of the room. Clara Ara's lips moved, her voice breaking into a plea: "I paid with my own money." But her words were drowned in the silence of judgment, her defense no match for the cold cadence of policy. A flush spread across her cheeks as tears pooled, yet she stood rooted, pinned beneath the collective gaze. The verdict wasn't written on paper. It was written in the stares that pierced her, branding her guilty. Her voice wavered, cracked under the weight of desperation. "Please, I have a son. He's sick. I can't lose this job." The words barely reached Brenda, who cut them off with the slice of a hand. "You should have thought of him before this," she retorted, her tone as merciless as stone. She demanded the apron, her gesture sharp, final. Clara Ara's hands shook as she untied the strings, peeling away the fabric heavy with grease and humiliation. She placed it on the counter, tears sliding down her face unchecked. The room remained hushed, every witness locked in silent complicity. At table 7, the homeless man lifted his head, blue eyes wide with a helpless grief. He wanted to speak, but the weight of the moment silenced him. Clara Ara's vision blurred, the world shrinking to shame and loss. She turned toward the lockers, the sound of her own footsteps unbearably loud. In that instant, the fragile thread of her survival snapped. She was no longer an employee. She was discarded. She moved through the streets as though half asleep, her body present, but her mind drowned in a single word that pulsed over and over, fired. The familiar sights of Chicago blurred past her, The iron skeleton of the train tracks overhead, the gray pulse of traffic, the chatter of strangers. She saw none of it. A cold wind sliced through her thin coat, numbing her skin, whipping her hair into her eyes. Her hands trembled as she clutched her nearly empty bag, its weight so light it mocked her. The world carried on indifferent to her ruin. She staggered up the cracked steps of her apartment building, the door creaking open into shadow. Inside, the silence pressed heavy, every corner reminding her that she had brought nothing back but loss. She dropped her bag onto the sagging sofa, the thud hollow lifeless. The darkness welcomed her not with comfort, but with a suffocating finality. For Clara Ara, the night had already begun, no matter what the clock said. Her eyes fell on the photograph by the window herself, David and little Leo frozen in time. David's smile was wide, his arm strung around her, his chef's whites crisp and proud. She remembered the day he was praised for his talent, how food seemed to bloom under his hands. But she remembered more sharply the day it ended. A birthday cake for a dishwasher, a simple kindness flour and sugar stolen in the eyes of the company. They called it theft, stripped him of his job, his dignity, his future. She remembered the way his shoulders slumped after that, how his laughter faded, how silence filled their home like smoke. Within a year, shame and despair had carved the life out of him, leaving her with debts and a child too young to understand. Now, standing in the same apartment, Clara Ara felt the wound tear open again. The company hadn't just ended David, it had circled back, swallowing her in the same merciless way. She stepped quietly into Leo's room. The boy slept curled against his blanket, his chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. His small face glowed faintly in the dim light, peaceful, unburdened. Clara Ara sank into the chair beside his bed, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I'm sorry, my love." The words barely escaped before her throat closed, choked with grief. She lowered her head to the mattress, her tears spilling hot and unchecked, soaking into the sheets. The soundless sobs shook her body, her shoulders quivering as though the weight of the world pressed down all at once. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep the pieces from breaking apart. Each drop of salt water carried her shame, her helplessness, her fear of failing him. In that quiet room with her son asleep beside her, Clara Ara shattered. The night absorbed her pain, and not even the walls offered comfort. The rags were gone. In their place, a tailored suit of charcoal wool, the weight of wealth pressed across Harlan West's shoulders. He sat in the back of his car, city lights scattering across the tinted glass like shards of cold fire. Outside, the tower that bore his name loomed above Chicago, all gleaming steel and glass. Once it had seemed like triumph. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. A tablet rested on his lap, its glow illuminating the page of an employee file, Clara Ara Miller. His eyes traced the details: hire date, address, dependent son. Then a name at the bottom cut deeper than any number: David Miller. Harlan's chest tightened, memory flashing. Years ago, a chef dismissed for baking a birthday cake with stolen flour. He remembered the smug pride of managers boasting about discipline and his own silent nod of approval. Now the truth stood before him. He had watched a widow broken by the same system that had destroyed her husband, and it was his signature that had made it possible. Sleep never came. Harlan paced his penthouse, the city sprawled beneath him, each window a reminder of lives ruled by his pen. The words from the diner replayed relentlessly Clara Ara's quiet defense, the manager's cold triumph, the look of humiliation he had done nothing to stop. He loathed the policies he once called efficient, loathed the culture he had cultivated. At dawn, his reflection stared back from the glass lined with exhaustion but sharpened with resolve. He pressed a button on the intercom. "Cancel my meetings. All of them. Ready the car. We're going back to the Golden Spoon." His assistant faltered on the other end but obeyed. Harlan straightened his tie jaw set. For years he had built walls of numbers and policies to insulate himself, but the night had stripped them bare. He would walk into that diner not as a spectator in disguise, but as the man who bore responsibility, and he would begin tearing the rot from its roots. Dawn found the Golden Spoon brittle with unease. Plates clattered, softer footsteps slowed, every gesture sharpened by fear. The memory of yesterday lingered like smoke. Clara Ara's dismissal had left the air hollow. At the counter, Brenda strode with the swaggering authority clipboard tucked under her arm as if it were a crown. She carried herself like a victor on the battlefield, her smirk daring anyone to defy her. Around her, staff moved with mechanical obedience, faces, pale eyes lowered. The booths filled with early customers, but the hum of chatter was subdued wary. Without Clara Ara's steady presence, the rhythm of the place faltered. Even the walls seemed dimmer, as if the light itself recoiled. Brenda relished it. She scanned the floor with hawk-like precision, ready to strike at the smallest misstep. To the staff, the diner felt less like a workplace and more like a trap. And in that silence, an uneasiness gathered heavy as a storm about to break. The door swung open with a weight that silenced the room. Harlan West stepped inside, dressed in a black suit that carried authority like armor. Two aides followed, sleek portfolios in hand, their presence amplifying the gravity of the moment. Conversation died instantly. Forks hovered above plates. Even the hiss of the kitchen seemed to falter. Brenda, mid-sip of coffee, froze. The cup slipped from her fingers and shattered at her feet, dark liquid spreading across the tiles. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The staff stared, first in disbelief, then in recognition. The man they had dismissed as a vagrant only yesterday now stood revealed as the head of their empire. The diner's heartbeat changed. For some, it was terror. For others, a fierce secret thrill. The power dynamic inverted in a single breath, the hunter, now prey. Harlan's gaze swept the room with calm precision, and it was clear this was not a visit. It was a reckoning. He walked straight toward her, each step measured, his expression carved from ice. Brenda's posture shrank as she stammered, "Sir, I followed protocol, exactly as the handbook instructs." Her words spilled out brittle, desperate for cover. Harlan's eyes narrowed, his voice slicing through her excuses. "I wrote that protocol. I signed it. And today, I am ashamed of it." The weight of his admission landed like a hammer. Every employee froze, every customer leaned closer, silence filling the diner like heavy smoke. Brenda's face drained of color, her authority crumbling with the ground she had always stood on. Her clipboard hung useless at her side. For the first time, she had no policy to shield her, no rule to wield as a weapon. She stood alone before the architect of her power, and he had just declared it rotten. In that silence, she was not the manager, not the victor. She was exposed, stripped bare, and utterly powerless. Harlan pulled a phone from his pocket, dialed a number, and waited. The staff watched the tension coiled tighter with each passing ring. Then her voice answered, wary, fragile, hello. His tone softened, carrying none of the authority he had worn moments earlier. "Clara Ara, Miller. You don't know me as I am now. Yesterday, I was the man at table 7. Silence thickened on the line. He continued, steady, remorseful, "I owe you an apology. I owe you more than that. And I need to speak of David." At the mention of her husband's name, a sharp intake of breath carried across the connection. Clara Ara could find no words, her mind racing to reconcile the ragged man she had fed with the CEO now speaking to her. Finally, after a long pause, she whispered, "I'll come." The decision trembled in her voice, but it was made. The storm that had crushed her life was calling her back into its center, and she would face it. Whispers rippled across the floor, hushed voices darting between tables as the staff stole quick glances toward the door. No one dared speak too loudly, but anticipation was written across their faces. In the corner, Brenda sat, stiff, her clipboard abandoned at her side. Her hands twitched against her lap knuckles, pale, her shoulders trembling despite her best efforts to appear composed. Harlan stood at the center, tall, unmoving, his features carved with cold restraint. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, commanded the silence as if the air itself bowed to him. The diner held its breath, each tick of the clock stretching into eternity. The sound of coffee dripping, of cutlery shifting, felt magnified against the heavy quiet. Everyone present sensed the weight of the moment. Something irreversible was coming. They knew the woman at the center of yesterday's storm had been summoned, and the diner braced itself, each heart pounding in the pause before her return. The taxi pulled up outside, brakes hissing in the cold air. Through the window, staff pressed closer to catch a glimpse. Clara Ara stepped out wrapped in a plain coat, her figure hesitant yet unbroken. Her eyes flicked toward the entrance, uncertainty pulling at every movement. Inside, her coworkers followed her with a mixture of pity and admiration, their gazes soft with unspoken solidarity. Brenda lowered her head, sweat beading at her temple, her earlier bravado dissolved into silence. At the sight of her, Harlan rose. His chair scraped softly against the floor as he walked forward, every eye following. The diner hushed to absolute stillness, breaths caught waiting. Clara Ara crossed the threshold, her steps small but steady, and in that silence it was as though fate itself had paused. She was no longer just a fired waitress. She was the figure on whom the balance of power now turned. Harlan's voice carried across the room, steady weighted with gravity. "Clara Ara Miller," he began. "I owe you an apology, one to you and one to your husband David." Her knees nearly gave way at the sound of David's name. Tears welled, spilling before she could stop them. He continued unflinching, his words slicing through the quiet. "My system destroyed him. The culture I allowed buried his dignity, and yesterday it sought to do the same to you. I cannot undo what has been lost, but I can tell you this: we were wrong." The diner gasped, staff exchanging stunned glances, customers frozen in disbelief. Brenda sat as though the floor had dropped beneath her face collapsing under the truth she had served so faithfully. Around them, silence deepened, not of judgment now, but of awe. The man at the top of the empire was bowing his head to the woman it had tried to break. Harlan stood tall, his words cutting through the thick silence. "Today marks the end of what we have been," he declared. "From this moment, we begin again. We will build the West Care Initiative, a program to protect and support every employee in hardship. No more soulless policies that crush dignity over pennies. No more managers rewarded for cruelty. Training will change, incentives will change, and this company will change." His voice deepened, each word striking like a bell echoing off the diner's walls. The staff looked at one another, eyes wide, as if the ground beneath them had shifted. Even the customers, caught in the orbit of this upheaval, leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing the death of one empire and the birth of another. The diner, once thick with despair, felt suddenly electric, alive with the first notes of hope. Harlan's promise was not just corporate reform, it was a vow that what had broken David, what had humiliated Clara Ara, would never claim another life again. He turned, then fixing his gaze on Clara Ara, and the room held its breath. "I don't just want you to return to your job," he said. "I want you to lead the West Care Initiative." The words struck her like lightning. Her hands trembled, her lips parted, but no sound came. She shook her head, overwhelmed. "I'm just a waitress," she whispered. But Harlan stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. "You don't need credentials. You don't need a polished resume. You need what you already have: courage, integrity, and a heart that refuses to turn cold. That is what this company needs now, more than ever." Around them, tears welled in the eyes of her co-workers, some covering their mouths to hide emotion. In that moment, the woman once discarded as disposable labor was being lifted into the center of a revolution. The shift was breathtaking, from invisible to indispensable, from powerless to a leader whose worth could no longer be denied. In the corner, Brenda sat rigid, but her composure was unraveling thread by thread. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an anchor in the storm, for some policy, some rule, some weapon to cling to. But all she had built her world upon, numbers, quotas, discipline, was crumbling before her eyes. The clipboard slid from her grasp, landing with a dull thud. She pressed her trembling hands to her face, but the tears broke through, spilling against her will. For the first time, the woman who had barked orders and cut lives short with a signature looked small, fragile, human. The authority in her voice was gone. There was no venom left to spit. She sat, bowed, defeated, as if stripped not just of her position, but of the very identity she had clung to. The others looked on, not with pity, but with the sharp release of satisfaction. The tyrant had fallen, and her fall was absolute. It began, quietly, a single waitress stepping forward to wrap her arms around Clara Ara. Then another. Soon, the staff that had once stood paralyzed by fear gathered around her, pulling her into an embrace that spoke louder than words. Tears streamed freely, not just hers but theirs, a release of years spent bowing under the weight of silence and obedience. Applause broke out, unsteady at first, then swelling into something undeniable. A feeling spread like wildfire: vindication, liberation, the sense that decency had finally been seen and rewarded. For the first time, they were not cogs in a machine, but people with worth. Harlan stood apart, watching the scene unfold, and gave a small nod as though sealing the moment into memory. The Golden Spoon, once nothing more than a tired diner in a cold city, had become something more that morning, a symbol of change, a birthplace of dignity reclaimed. When the voices quieted, Harlan spoke again, his words steady and deliberate. "From this day forward," he said, "we will not build on rigid laws that break people. We will build on humanity, on compassion. No company can survive without its people, and it's time we remembered that." His declaration lingered in the air, not as a speech, but as a vow. The employees stared at him, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with trust, a foreign feeling after so many years of suspicion. Even Brenda, broken and silent, lowered her head in acknowledgement of the truth she could no longer deny. Clara Ara lifted her gaze toward him, her eyes shining through tears, seeing not the stranger she had once fed, but the man now pledging to right what had been wrong. For the first time in years, the room was filled with something stronger than fear, hope. Her lips trembled as she whispered the words, fragile yet resolute. "I'll do it." The diner's hush deepened as if the walls themselves leaned closer. A trembling smile spread across her face, small but radiant, carrying the weight of a woman who had walked through despair and found purpose on the other side. Thoughts of Leo flashed before her, the boy waiting at home, the boy who deserved a future brighter than medical bills and empty cupboards. Thoughts of David followed his memory, no longer just a wound, but a guiding light. What had been taken from her family would now become the seed of something greater. Around her, hands clapped together, at first scattered, then thunderous, an ovation that rose and filled every corner of the diner. Clara Ara Miller, once cast out as a liability, now stood reborn, not only restored, but entrusted with a mission to turn suffering into meaning. Clara Ara stepped through the revolving doors into a world she had only glimpsed from the outside. Glass walls gleamed under the morning sun, polished floors stretched into endless corridors, and the hush of power hung in the air. Once this place would have dwarfed her, made her feel like a trespasser in a cathedral built for others. But today, her stride was steady, her head lifted. A plaque on the office door caught her eye. Director, West Care Initiative. The words glimmered like a quiet victory, proof that she had clawed her way through humiliation, grief, and fear to stand here. She touched the edge of the nameplate with her fingertips, not to boast, but to remember. Every shard of pain, every tear shed in silence had led to this moment. It wasn't just an office, it was a declaration. She had survived, and now she would lead. A new chapter had begun. As she settled into her new office, memories surged unbidden. She saw herself again under the diner's harsh lights, stripped of her dignity by Brenda's words. She felt the sting of tears on her cheeks, the cold air biting her skin as she walked home empty-handed. She heard the sound of Leo's cough in the night, the sound that had haunted her with the fear of losing him too. Each recollection was a scar, deep and raw. Yet now none of it seemed meaningless. The humiliation had hardened into resolve, the grief into fire. Every wound had shaped her into the woman who now sat with the power to shield others from the same fate. Pain had not destroyed her. It had forged her. She looked at the city skyline through the glass wall, and for the first time she saw not obstacles but horizons waiting to be reached. That evening, back in their modest apartment, Leo reached for her hand with his small, fragile fingers. His wide eyes studied her face, then drifted to the badge clipped neatly to her jacket. "Mom," he whispered, wonder thick in his voice. "Are you the boss?" Now Clara Ara laughed, the sound breaking into something half sob, half joy. She swept him into her arms, pressing her cheek against his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, but everything I do it for you." Leo grinned, satisfied with her answer, as though the world had tilted finally in their favor. A single tear slid down Clara Ara's cheek, but this one was different, no longer bitter, no longer desperate. It was the kind of tear born of relief, of a promise fulfilled, of love preserved against all odds. In that embrace, the long shadow of despair lifted, replaced by light. Mother and son together had stepped out of the darkness at last. Word spread quickly, carried from diner to diner, from one weary worker to another. Employees whispered Clara Ara's name as though it were proof that kindness could survive even in the harshest places. Policies once used as chains were rewritten into shields, offering protection instead of punishment. Managers who had ruled through fear found themselves stripped of power. Brenda vanished, erased by the very system she had once embodied. The golden spoon, once a symbol of quiet suffering, became something new, proof that justice could grow from the smallest act of defiance. Across the company, a sense of safety took root, fragile but real. It was not revolution through force, but through a single decision, one woman choosing humanity over policy. From that choice, an empire bent on numbers was learning to bend toward people. The ripple had become a tide. Before an audience of thousands, Harlan stood tall but unguarded. "It is not cold rules that sustain us," he said, his voice measured and clear. "It is human compassion. Without it, no company, no matter how vast, can endure." The confession shocked, then moved the crowd. He did not speak as a man in command, but as one willing to admit the ruin his signature had once caused. Beside him stood Clara Ara, her presence luminous, no longer invisible. Her gaze shone with quiet strength, embodying the very truth he now proclaimed. A murmur of agreement swelled, not coerced but genuine, a unity long starved now finding air. The words traveled beyond the walls, carried into headlines, retold in homes shared like a lesson too vital to forget. What had begun as humiliation in a small diner had become a message to the world. Empathy could rebuild what power had broken. Clara Ara walked slowly through the park, her hand clasped around Leo's. The morning sun spilled across the grass, gilding the world in gentle warmth. For the first time in years, her chest did not feel heavy, but steady whole. She glanced at her son, his smile wide, his small steps light beside hers. A quiet smile touched her lips, fragile yet unshakable. The storms had passed, leaving behind not ruin but renewal. As they moved forward, mother and child, side by side, one truth remained: kindness, simple and defiant, had the power to shake an empire and build a future worth believing in.